I said first, just talk about your history. How do you become a union organizer?
Well, I became a union organizer in an unfortunate way because I got hurt at work.
What was
And
the
I
job?
was
What
working,
was the job you have doing?
huh?
What kind of job were you doing?
What'd you say? I was working as a carpenter in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I had gotten into the union and considered myself very lucky because most of the people in the union were there only because their fathers were in the union already. And I was working for a non-union contractor who decided to bid on bigger jobs, and so he joined the union. And I got to come in. He shortly after went bankrupt, but I was able to transition into the local and had settled down in a house and a wife, and everything was going well. And then I tore up my back at work and was in incredible pain. It was a herniated disc, and at that time, herniated discs could not be treated as easily as they are today. And so I was out for an extended period of time on workers' compensation. And I met a guy from the local service employees union in Worcester, which represented the city of Worcester and some surrounding towns, who was organizing a hospital, St. Vincent's Hospital. And at that time, it was run by the nuns. Last year, it had a 10-month strike because it was owned by a corporation out of Texas. It's kind of a symbol of the changes in the U.S. economy over the last 50 years. So he asked for help passing out leaflets at the hospital. And I said, sure, when I can walk, I'll be glad to do it with you and help out. We became friends. Doctors said you can't go back to work in the trade anymore. And the local had some money and they offered me a job at basically minimum wage and said, you can organize whatever you can get. And so we then organized the surrounding towns and tried to organize a nursing home, organized a big county hospital. And so I stayed with that for about 3 years. I then got tired of living in the same place, and for personal reasons, I switched and went to work for the United Electrical Workers for 8 years, 9 years. Traveled 6 different locations, lived in 6 different places, from Massachusetts to Los Angeles to North Carolina to South Carolina to Pennsylvania, anyhow. And eventually ended up in Philadelphia, first on a temporary assignment and then on a permanent assignment. And a very nice woman there said, why don't you buy the house next door to us? And so I looked at that on Rohrer Street, and the house turned out to be not available, but there was one around the corner, and I bought that. And we've been great friends ever since. I then worked for a local in Philadelphia through 1988 to kind of stay in town. I then left there, went briefly to work in Washington, and then went to St. Louis as an organizing director for the clothing and textile workers to get back on the road. But in my brief moments in Washington, I met a local officer who was very attractive, and we've now been married almost 34 years.
No.
And I organized until 1992 when our oldest son came, and it was just not compatible. So I was a stay-at-home dad for 5 years. And then I worked 15 years at a community college teaching labor education, doing union training, and I'm still doing it. I had a couple of people last night lining up trainings. We're doing them on Zoom now, which is very nice because you can reach people anywhere in the world. And I had a very nice woman, for example, from Australia who took a class, and it was 5 a.m. for her to come, but she was really great and appreciated the fact that we were teaching the kinds of classes that she couldn't get down there. So life goes on. And it's a real struggle. It's a very, very tough time for the union movement in this country. And the challenges and how workers are responding are very, very different. We see the enormous gap over the last 50 years between workers and the wealthy. And particularly during COVID, the wealthiest people increased their wealth by like 60%, while most of us took not only took pay cuts, but worked in very dangerous conditions in healthcare facilities and in meat packing and places like that, where we were considered essential public services. And even Amazon warehouses are considered essential public services, so they didn't stop work. And people didn't test, they didn't necessarily wear masks right away, there was improper ventilation, and it was really a crisis. And what we have seen, though, is that workers responded individually to that crisis. In 2022, last year, about 51 million workers quit their jobs. And so rather than trying to change the jobs where they were and organize, they left. And where they went and what the conditions were in their other jobs, you can't tell. But I always say that your history of China certainly shows this, that when people are collectively in a bad situation, there are 3 doors they can go through. And one door is to do nothing and to complain and to whine, but to kind of submit. Door number 2 is to individually escape and move up or move out or change. And you see that in a lot of jobs where people will say, well, the job is terrible, but I see a better job up the street, I'm going to go to that. And door number 3 is they try and organize to change the jobs where they are. And we're seeing a flicker of activity in that area this year. And the challenges are that the difficulty of organizing, the opposition of the bosses, the failure of the laws, but the difficulties that union officers have got figuring out how to get a contract. And they will stand around and proclaim, I went to a meeting last night where a woman says, oh, it's a great time. 71% of the people in the country support unions. And I said to her, yeah, and 5% are in unions. 10% total, you got 30% in the public sector. So all that support doesn't mean a thing. And we have lost all the conditions that you knew when you were working in Philadelphia, the equal pay for equal work, a company pension, a fully paid health insurance, cost of living clauses, things like that. And those are all gone. And we're seeing, for example, in recent strikes and negotiations, the UPS and now the auto workers, an attempt to eliminate what's called 2-tiered wage systems. And that came in the 1980s, where they would say, okay, you're all working here, you're going to get a great increase. People who are hired after you are going to come in at significantly less and never get to the level you are. And it was an incentive for existing workers to vote in favor of a contract because it wasn't going to affect them. They figure, well, it's not me, I don't care. And the new hires often were not covered by a pension plan, would get a 401k or some sort of a investment. Often we see in the 80s, and I went through negotiations then, insurance copay, because at one time it was considered normal for a company to fully pay a family health insurance. Now it's unknown. And the last contract about 6 or 7 years ago at Verizon finally eliminated that. And so the workers have been pushed back. One of the things I talk about is in the 1950s, 1957 or so, workers were about 37% of the workforce. And it was estimated that another 40% of the workforce got our conditions, because that's what the employers had to provide in order to get people to work there. We are now 10% of the workforce. So the non-union, the Walmarts and the Amazons set the conditions. And so we have really gone backward dramatically in that period of time. All right.
Yeah. Wow. No, the first union organizing job, that was a building trade?
Yeah, in the carpenters, yeah.
Yeah, was that the Teamsters or just
no, it was the carpenters union.
Just carpenters union. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, what you'll see in the building trades is that there are craft unions, and craft unions represent a single skill. We had the plumbers, the electricians, the steam fitters, the carpenters. There was a group of laborers who did the so-called unskilled work.
right.
And the carpenters were really the aristocrats of big construction jobs. And it was good. I was an apprentice. We had night school 2 nights a week, and battles, and went on strike for 5 weeks one time, but it was fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned a skill, and I was
Craft
really
union.
sorry.
What's that? What do you say?
I mean, one of the things that it gave me was an insight into the lives of industrial workers today, because I thought I had my whole life planned out, and I knew what was going to happen. It was going to be economically secure, and everything was going to go great. And all of a sudden, it's not there. And what you see in steel industry, auto industry, generators, like you're talking about, is people work, for example, at the steel plant where I've done histories of Sparrows Point. They were often 3rd generation workers, and their grandfather had retired from there, their father had retired from there. And I graduate from high school on Friday, get married on Saturday, start work there on Monday, and I figure I'm going to do the same. And all of a sudden, it's not there. It's gone. And the anger that provoked that has been a huge support for people like Donald Trump, because he says he's going to make America great again. It means he promises to turn the clock back so the conditions were what they were, what I thought they were going to be. And as I said, I had in 1973, 72, when I got hurt, a huge adjustment to make, because all of a sudden I was not going to be able to do what I thought I was going to be able to do. And it was a real challenge. And not all people, and I was able to adjust. Not all people are able to do that and are angry.
Do you work in the carpenter after you had a college, or you had a high school? What do you have education-wise?
No, I had some college, and then I went to Vermont and did some homesteading with a friend, and we needed money, so I picked up working as a carpenter for a local guy, and I really liked it, and it became a skill that I was able to use. I started non-union as what they call a carpenter's helper,
Right.
and you stuff shingles up. I think that's one of the things that did my back in. You take bundles of shingles, one on each shoulder, and go up a ladder to the roof. And but as I said, I enjoyed it. I like working outside. I even like working outside in the cold weather. I liked the people I work with. It was a very different group, and a very tolerant group. That is, we had a lot of late 60s political controversies on the job. For example, I was a public draft resistor.
Oh,
And
and
had an article in the newspaper to try and,
you're anti-war.
Well, I was not only anti-war, but I was called to get drafted, and I said, I'm not going to go. I went through the whole thing of not stepping forward. And in order to try and build a movement in Worcester, we had an article in the newspaper. And then I came back to work, and nobody said a word about it. And only a couple of years later, I have a dispute with one of the other guys who said, yeah, and by the way, I want to not talk to you about that military stuff. But a very tolerant group, and it was all white men, so it was very different, but it was a good place, and we enjoyed it, and very, very strong union people. I remember I often talk about this. I give blood every 3 months, but my first union steward, and I can't use the language on a broadcast like this, but my first day on a big job, it was huge, and I was working for a subcontractor. They were speaking French. They were from New Hampshire and Quebec. Anyhow, I was scared to death. And about 2 minutes after I started work, this huge figure came up to me, and he was wearing like 3 coats. It was in January in Massachusetts. And he growled at me. He said, "Are you the new kid on the job?" And I went, "Yes." And I thought, "Oh man, this is gonna be over." He says, "Anybody F's with you, you come get me. I'm your Dick Matthews, I'm your union steward. Anybody F's with you, come get me." And I thought I died and gone to heaven. And I then, started going to the union meetings, were twice a month. He took a spill a couple of years later off of staging, and the local ran a blood bank for him. And I was the first person to come down and donate. I've been doing it ever since. But every time I give blood, I think of him. And obviously, he's long gone. But there was a sense on the job. It was 100% union, and nobody was allowed on the job without being a member of any trade. And I often work with building trades here who will work. I've had a discussion a few years ago with a steam fitter local that was working in an Amazon or a Walmart warehouse, I think, but they were the only union trade there. Everybody else was non-union. I said, that's not the way you're going to build the movement. You've got to shut it off. But the sense of solidarity that the people had on the job was terrific. And it was the kind of thing we need to have today.
Okay, so following what that says, that what's like working in a non-union shop? What's the difference between union shop and non-union shop?
Horrible, horrible. That's one of the reasons that I always object when people talk about the United States as a democracy, because it's not, because people spend the majority of their waking hours in a fascist authoritarian system. Because you work in a non-union shop, you have nothing. You are no control over your pay other than minimum wage, no requirement that you get health insurance, vacations, sick days, pension, anything. And you can be fired at any time for any reason. Good reason, bad reason, no reason. And one of the things that was so important for the unions was that the supervisors would often use discrimination to decide who they were going to keep and who they were not. And a very, very good story called Striking Steel, a guy, Jack Metzger, talks about being a young guy during the steelworker strike of 1957, but he talks about how his father got organizing. And what would happen in the steel mill was that every Friday, every worker had to bring in a present for the supervisor. And if they would go hunting, they would bring in sausages or deer or a bottle of liquor or something like that. And they just accepted that as a condition of employment. And what really turned the corner for them was when a supervisor said to one of the guys, "You've really got a nice looking daughter. I want to go out with her." And that was going too far. And so they began to organize. But we've had, even in a union shop, I had a student years ago at General Motors who came up from the South as a young woman, African-American woman, was working second shift, and people would drive her home. And one night, the supervisor came to her and they were working overtime and her ride had left. And the supervisor said, "Well, I'll drive you home." And she said, "No." And he said, "Okay, well, then go out in the middle of the plant and check out something." She sent her out in the middle of this enormous building and then turned the lights off and left. I mean, so that's how people were treated. We have thousands of stories of how people, particularly women and particularly African Americans or immigrants, were treated. And what the union does is eliminate that, ideally, so that your contract tells you what you're going to get paid, what you're going to get as overtime, what you're going to have for retirement, what you're going to have for health insurance, and a grievance procedure and union reps to help you, exactly as Dick Matthews came to me and said, "I will, anybody F's with you, you come get me." And he didn't say, "Here's your contract," or anybody, violates that. He just said, "I'm here. I'm your steward." And it was just terrific. And I use that story when I do steward training as an example of how to talk to members. But what we're seeing is, and I've seen two stages of it, the transformation of the economy in the United States. And from the 70s and 80s, where plants were locally owned, and the owners had some sort of a sense of relationship with the employees and with the community. And by the 90s, it became very different. It was a national economy, places like Walmart, stuff like that, no ties to anything or to anybody. And we're now in a global situation where you don't know, your plant or your workplace could be owned by a post office box in the Cayman Islands. And so the difficulties of organizing and getting a contract are enormously complicated. And the officers of the unions have not kept up. And so that's why we are not seeing huge campaigns even today. We're seeing bursts like the Amazon warehouse on Staten Island, but it is really in challenge and it hasn't got a contract. I have a book out on how to get a first contract, and it talks that when places do get a contract, it takes them more than 400 days. That's a whole year and 3 months. And one of the challenges is that in many places, Amazon, for example, is the model. They want to have 150% worker turnover every year. And a lot of it is hiring people in October and for the holiday rush, and they don't need them, so they pay them to actually bonuses to leave. But it challenges that workforce relationship that people need to organize, where you know your coworker and you may see them off the job, things like that. And so there's not a challenge. There's no campaigns, for example, other than that at Amazon. There's no campaigns at Walmart. There's no campaigns like at Home Depot or Lowe's, these large, and it become retail. There's no organizing. The United Auto Workers does not represent any foreign auto manufacturers in the country, and there are huge numbers of them spread across the South. And we're now seeing the challenge of new companies coming with the electric vehicles. And it's going to be a transformation of the auto industry and of the skills needed and of the ownership. And I often use a example, a guy, Milton Friedman, who won prizes for economics, but he had a book and an op-ed in the New York Times in 1970, put out the belief that corporations have only one responsibility, and that's to make as much money as possible for their shareholders. And so the concern for the employees, the concern for the communities, it's all just gone. And that attitude is then taught in business schools for several generations now. So when people come in as managers, they are indoctrinated that that's what you gotta do, and makes unionism much, much more important. And I think we're seeing a lot of that, from the little I know, in China, where the conditions have dramatically changed, and you've got foreign ownership and these multi-corporations coming in, and people in the 70s when I was there who thought they had good working conditions and well paid and treated, and no longer there. No longer there.
You can tell us at least one organizing campaign that you are proud of.
Well, there are a lot of them. I think the one that really stands out is the one where I was living in Philadelphia, but working up in Berwick, Pennsylvania, which is northeastern Pennsylvania. And I had to move up there, and it was a shop of about 220 people. They'd had a company union, they affiliated with us and then joined. But I basically lived in that area for 2 years, rented a house up there. And the people in the shop were just great. And the dedication to the union was enormous. And we had a vote for the company union to join us, and we won it by one vote, 103 to 102. And then, I'm told, or I was told at the time, that a guy who voted for us did it by mistake because he colorblind or something like that. I'm not quite sure what happened. The company challenge, we had to go through a labor board election, which we won by a significantly bigger margin. But to just stay there and be part of their lives and get the contract was a huge experience, and I really enjoyed it.
What kind of shop was it? What kind of
They
industry?
made soundproof booths. It was a steel fabrication shop,
Uh-huh.
and they would do soundproof booths that would be installed in factories.
And was it all male or male, female?
There was a very few. There were like 4 females, and one of the
Oh,
things we split the shop. 2 of them were for the union, 2 of them were against it.
oh. And how about black
Everything.
people? Other than
One black guy.
mostly all white.
Yeah, it was a geographic area which was very different. I mean, we had a very good campaigns in Philadelphia
Mhm.
where I had a work recognition strike, but it was a very, very small shop, all Hispanics and blacks. It was a very different population, but that was really fun. It was only like 25 people, so it was not as big as the other ones. And I would say you were around, the girls were around when I was involved in the newspaper strike in Philadelphia for 46 days.
Right.
And our local was about 1,400, about 4,500 people, all 9 different unions. So it was a very complicated situation, but I was glad we came through that, and the strength of our members increased enormously. And that's what you want when you do negotiations, to come out of the negotiations with the union stronger than it went in. That's what happened there.
Mm-hmm. The ones that you are proud of. So you talked about one in the with a well 500 people. Yeah, you win by 1 vote, and then talk about another small shop. Then you talked about your Enquire strike. The organizing effort that you're proud of in your organizing life.
Well, I told you the ones I'm proud of. I can tell you the ones that didn't go well.
Oh yeah,
and it was really a symptom when I was organizing General Electric and Westinghouse in the South and in North Carolina and South Carolina, and we were just not able to break through. And the companies, General Electric particularly, had a very sophisticated program of anti-unionism, of moving shops. For example, there was a huge shop in Leicester, Pennsylvania, which is just south of the airport. A turbine plant had 7,000 workers for Westinghouse. And what they did in the late 60s, early 70s was break it up into 5 different locations and move it. One of them to Tampa, Florida, one of them to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, one of them to Charlotte, one of them to Round Rock, Texas. And what they did was they went into these areas and they hired people who had no experience in industrial work. They worked in textile mills and in agricultural tobacco farming, and said, we're going to pay you what the union shops get, so you don't need a union. And obviously they didn't pay what the union shops were getting. The cost of living was lower. The benefits were not great, and they had total authority. It was like the plantation came back because these workers had no rights whatsoever. But it's a very, very different anti-union strategy than a lot of companies who figure out just treat everybody like dirt. And then if the union shows up, I'll hire a consultant. And there was a very famous guy in the early 80s named Marty Levitt who symbolized this. And he wrote a book called Confessions of a Union Buster. Mm-hmm. And the idea was, we're not going to do anything until the union shows up and do it. General Electric, Westinghouse were proactive. They said, we're going to make sure that it's difficult. Geographically, they're located in places with very low union density, hired from wide ranges, and designed the plants so that they were well back from the road, so the union organizers could not get close to the workers. I remember a campaign in Massachusetts at a factory where I could walk on the sidewalk and I could hand leaflets up through a window directly into somebody in the factory. The geography in North Carolina was that the plants were maybe a quarter of a mile back from the road. So if you were going to do leaflets, and this was, for all your people who are listening, a leaflet is a piece of paper that we used to organize. It was pre-social media. But in order to leaflet, you had to stand at the entrance to the driveway and hope that people would stop on their way in or their way out of work. And sometimes they were rushed and sometimes they couldn't. obviously it was very difficult at 11:30 at night to get people to stop as they were leaving second shift. It was difficult to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, get the third shift as they were coming. So it was the obstacles that the companies very smartly figured out. And a man named Lemuel Bulwer from General Electric had a whole program he called Making Unions Unnecessary. And what he figured is, I'm going to pay the benefits, I'm going to provide the treatment. One of the things that was very interesting in non-union plants was, if it was your birthday, the company would have a party in the cafeteria and bring a cake in. And people who've been treated so badly in the South thought that this was a whole kind of a revelation. And it was, we're treated great and we're okay. We don't need a union. So it was fine.
So how long you stayed there, and when, how do you decide to stop that campaign, cut the losses?
Well, at some point, you just figure, in one case, we had an election at Charlotte, we lost it by like 2-1. And one of the challenges was that the union didn't have the resources to just leave people in town indefinitely, which it could have done. I'm seeing that today with the same union, United Electrical Workers, which has had a whole surge in the last year or so of organizing graduate students. And they've organized here at Johns Hopkins University, the major private university in Baltimore, a graduate student group of about 3,300 people. And I had one of them on as a guest speaker. I did a labor history courses this spring. And it's a very complicated group because about 10% turns over every year. They have new students coming in, people leaving.
Right.
But electrical workers, I think, have something like 12 or 13,000 graduate students in different locations. Mm-hmm. And to have the staff to negotiate that and do the organizing is enormous. And it's a real challenge. And I'm revising my organizing book. And a year ago, the unions in the AFL were supposed to give in a greater per capita to try and fund organizing. And I haven't seen any signs of success or even the expenditures of those funds. That is, the unions very casual about organizing. You'll see it, for example, in the auto industry. The president of the auto workers is trying to convince Joe Biden, when they subsidize electronic vehicle manufacturers, to require union recognition. And the companies are opposed to that. And the answer is, workers and unions got to do the organizing. Nobody's going to do it for us. It's not going to be handed to us. And it's been so long since unions did a concerted organizing programs. There's a very great history for your listeners called Operation Dixie. And it started after World War II. And the CIO unions, the industrial union, said this whole thing in the North is being threatened because companies are all moving south and we got to go organize them. And they went down and found that they were not able to do so. And so after about 3 years, they just gave up, which means you now have states throughout the South, which are almost exclusively non-union. And you saw, for example, last year in Bessemer, Alabama, the first Amazon election campaign. And Amazon still has, Alabama still has a minimum wage of $7.25. Amazon had a starting pay of like $16 an hour. And so you had a lot of people who figured, God, I've more than doubled my salary. I'm going to heaven. What do I need a union for? Mm. And the whole culture, the politics of the area, the churches of the area, the social organizations of the area are part of an anti-union structure. And they're supported and subsidized by the companies. And so the country has really shifted from a time, and we often see it where in the second or third generations, people of my age used to sit at home and listen to parents talk about being in a union. Mm-hmm. And now that's gone, because people are non-union, so they'll talk about working a second job or treated, and it's a very different culture, and it's unfortunate.
God, I don't know where to start. I got a lot of questions, but I just what is the real reason behind that? After World War II, we had over almost 40% labor organizing. You're saying 37%, and what made it down to private sector 5%? What is the main
Well,
reason?
the companies rethought everything that they had done. And what you see in the 30s, for example, the organizing of the manufacturing, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Unions, organized an industrial union. An industrial union is one where all the workers at an employer are represented by one union.
Right.
In the carpenters union, you're all working for one employer, but you're represented by different unions based on your trade.
Mm-hmm.
And so the experience that you had up on Red Lion Road was that everybody from the tool and die makers to the custodians were all within the UAW local.
Right.
And that was a huge surge in the 1930s. People were taking over the factories, seizing work. They're having general strikes in cities like San Francisco. It was an enormous surge. And so the bosses with the government got together and they said, we need to control this. And so they passed the National Labor Relations Act, which put very severe, strict structures into the union movement, which people then began to accept. We went through the war, and the acceptance of the World Labor Board, so there were no raises and no strikes, was very important. After the war, the two parts, the Red Scare came and the anti-unionism, and they were together. And they really attacked left-wing people in unions and drove them out. So the unions became more conservative. But they changed the idea that a union has the responsibility not only for its members, but for its community and for other people. And so now when you negotiate, you just negotiate for yourself. You're seeing it occasionally in teachers' unions today, where they'll negotiate not only for wages, but for smaller class sizes, for more social workers, for more resources in the schools for the kids. So it's back to the old days. But that Red Scare in the late 40s decimated unions. And the companies, as I said, had a whole different approach. So they started moving from industrial areas to non-union areas. Mm-hmm. And an enormous number of shops moved, for example, from New York City into northeastern Pennsylvania, the garment shops. And the idea was, we're going to be here non-union. The coal industry is gone. We got people who are desperate for jobs. And, the union came and tried to organize them. But eventually, by the time I got up there in the early 80s, the lights were going out in a lot of the plants. And they were moving to the south globally. They were moving to Mexico, as you talked about, moving to China. And people like your parents who gave up their lives for a revolution, for a whole different structure, would be horrified today to see what's happened. And so it's a global economy. And you say to the average worker, you got to look at all this, and most of them don't want to. They want to go to work, get paid, come home, take care of their families, have dinner, go to a little league game and stuff like that. But you have to see yourself as now a citizen, a worker in the global economy, because everything that happens is global. And you see it here with Biden traveling to China. You see India now is becoming a huge location for low-wage work. Vietnam, in the 1960s, we all thought Vietnam was going to be a radical new society. And unfortunately, it's become a little bit like China. It's just a huge investment, low-wage factory place. So.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go more about the nitty-gritty of organizing. So you're talking about union busting tactics, you're talking about the successes and failures. How much you think that racism, sexism, and anti-immigrant affects labor movement?
Huge. It's always been huge. Divide and conquer. What it means is that in the early days, a lot of the places Operation Dixie, for example, when they went south, one of the challenges, left-wing organizers said, we're going to have meetings, union meetings, that we have workplaces which are integrated. We're going to have union meetings which are integrated. And there were some of the people that they were trying to organize said, absolutely not. I'm not going to sit in a room with a person of color. And it was a culture that had been in existence there for 100 years, going back to the slavery, the idea that somehow blacks are different and inferior. We found that when women come into manufacturing plants, they're just regarded with horror. Why don't you go home and take care of your husband? And these are women who are working. I've done these interviews with the steel workers from Sparrows Point, and I just did an interview with one black woman who started there in 1976, at a time when women were just starting to get hired. But many of the guys would not talk to her, wouldn't treat her as equal. They had horrible pornographic pictures up on the wall. And she had graduated from high school, took a year of college, and got pregnant and had to figure out a way to make a living. And she went to a welding school, learned how to weld, and came in and was more skilled than many of the white guys who had been there for a long time. And it was a very, very challenging situation. And the union really struggled in the 70s and early 80s to get through it. And you certainly see it today, where the opposition to immigrants and the difficulties. One of the things that I talk about in the area in Virginia, just south of Washington, D.C., the school system has like 140 different languages. And it's just a whole range of people. And it's really intensified. You look at the newspapers today, people fleeing countries. As my great-grandfather did, he came from Ireland, and they're looking for something better, and they just couldn't survive in their home country. And I think one of the problems with the United States capitalist system is that they make these countries so bad, they cut off investments and do things like in Venezuela, that people take door number two. They're more ambitious, and they individually leave. They don't change it. And you've certainly seen that immigration from China. A lot of people coming here, for example, to go to school and to survive. And it takes a certain income and it takes a certain consciousness in order to do that. But there's no question that anything that divides people keeps people from organizing. And so race and sex is and immigration status, very, very, sexual status. This whole question of gender and gay people and transgender and things like that, what kind of bathrooms are you going to have, is a divisive, destructive element for organizing.
And how does company purposely do that? I mean, I can understand people, the membership has racism, sexism, but how does company build on that?
Well, they hire a diverse workforce, and the supervisors egg it on. They don't stop bad talk in the workplace. Going back a lot of times in the steelworkers, the union officers didn't tell people you have to take those pornographic pictures down from your locker, or it's an embarrassment to the women, or you have to share your workspace with a woman or with a person of color. And there were often, going back many years, people said, no, I'm not going to do it. So, and so companies would hire to create divisions within the workforce, and makes it more difficult to organize. And a lot of times workers just can't overcome that. And you're certainly seeing that today in a divisive way in politics. That is, in 2020, Donald Trump got like 47% of the votes from union households. And his supporters are passionate, and they are often buying guns, and they're talking about banning books in libraries and things like that. But you bring that into a union, into a workforce. For example, you're trying to negotiate a contract. Can people overcome those difficulties to stay together. And as I said, we're seeing a lot of places now where you can't get contracts. You had to hold negotiations for the railroad industry, and the contracts were 3 years, 4 years, 5 years past expiration. And instead of the old days where you say, okay, the contract expires here today, that's it. No contract, no work, something's going to go on. The guys keep going, and the conditions get worse. They reduced crews, for example. They're now talking about airplanes maybe having one pilot. Well, you know, if that one pilot has a heart attack at 30,000 feet, where are you? And the kinds of situations I see, the flight attendants are trying to organize a couple of airlines, and the flight attendants don't get paid until the flight actually leaves. So while they're setting up, and if the flight is delayed, they're not paid. It's all these and the companies are making billions. I mean, one of the things that the auto workers strike has done so clearly is make an issue out of executive salaries. And you'll see that a head of General Motors, Mary Barra, makes $111,000 a day. I mean, just beyond conception. And the amount of wealth that the wealthiest people have made in odd industries, candy industries, things like that, enormous. And you could, for example, if you took all the stock buybacks, there was a story in the paper yesterday about limiting those, you could give every auto worker like $650,000 and still have billions left over. I mean, their money is there. We're just not getting it.
Right.
And you see it, a huge decline. I had a discussion this morning with someone. The state of Maryland is going to give $600 million to the baseball team to keep them in town, millionaire owners. 30,000 people in Baltimore City applied for public housing. That's 30,000 people who need a place to live. And I often say to my friends, we forget how privileged we are. You know, we have a house, food on the table, we're okay. And how difficult it is for so many people. You know, they're working 2 jobs or 3 jobs or take care and all kinds of other stuff. It's very, very different. And we've got to turn that around. And it's economically by organizing, it's politically by creating the labor parties and political actions. But everybody's got to do it. You can't wait for someone else to step in or hope that Joe Biden's going to wave a magic wand and everything will be okay. Doesn't happen.
So the divide and conquer is a conscious tactics by the corporations.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. And they also promote that in the workplace. Yeah.
And there are certain divisions in the even unionized workplace. For example, I often use this as an example. If you're in negotiations and you have $1 an hour on the table, the 60-year-old worker wants that dollar put into the pension fund. The 25-year-old worker wants it in the pocket. Neither of them is wrong. They just look at collective experience from an individual basis. And many years ago, I worked with the clothing and textile workers, and the industry was in decline. And so one of the things that they started doing was limiting health insurance to people who had no other insurance or whose spouse did not have insurance. And it was assumed that there was a 2-income family, for example, as you had insurance and Cindy had insurance. And so the company would have cut off Cindy off your insurance and cut it down. And it's a chiseling, saving money that goes to the stockholders and the executives. And so I think one of the things which is really important in this country, in the United States, is the absence of a national health insurance. And we would save enormous amounts of money and emotional stress by having a fully paid government plan. So you just go into the hospital and you see horrible healthcare conditions for many people. And it leads to major problems. The failure to treat overweight or certain problems leads to diabetes, which then leads to people having amputations. It's a whole issue. Every other country has it. This country is politically so backwards, the two parties, that they have now even started taking Medicare and turning it over to private companies. And so they make profit of it. It's not the direction we need to go.
Okay. Now, when you do organizing, how do you draw the line between union member and management? Like I say, you have workers, you have linemen, foremen, you have a hierarchy in the factory. How do you decide what level to organize? What is
well? It depends. If you use, for example, the private sector, National Labor Relations Law, they have certain definitions for who can qualify as a quote worker and who is not. And if you have the ability to hire and fire or effectively recommend, then you're considered quote management, not eligible for the union. That's one of the things which happened in the late 40s, because it used to be that everybody was in the union, and the supervisors know that the union will negotiate conditions for them. For example, if the union gets a paid holiday, the Teamsters, for example, I think in their new contract got Martin Luther King's birthday as a paid holiday, or maybe it was the auto workers. Supervisors get that as well. So they have an incentive to see the union do something that they otherwise couldn't do. Better health insurance, better pension, all that kind of stuff. But when you organize, you have to look at the workplace and figure who can be in. And often what I saw in areas is that companies will subcontract certain work within the workplace. I was organizing a place here in Baltimore, not successfully, that made liquid pharmaceuticals. But for the first 6 months that you worked there, you did not work for the company. You worked for a contractor, which was really just a post office box. And the idea was you work for that contractor and you hope that you could impress the employer enough that you would then be hired at the end of 6 months. And some were and some weren't. But it was a very divisive thing, and people in the workplace wore different colored hats depending on who the employer was.
Oh my God. Okay.
But you'll see companies like General Motors, which used to hire everybody. And the custodians who were cleaning the bathrooms and sweeping the floors were members of the union, being paid at the union scale. And it was often a job that workers on disability could do. If you hurt if I had a friend who is working in Arlington, Texas at a General Motors plant, and had a torn rotator cuff. And he ended up having to leave work, and challenges in Texas of workers' comp and all kinds of other stuff. But previous days, they would have said, fine, you just work here in maintenance where it's an easy job. You'll still get your pay. You'll still get your benefits. Now that's all subcontracted out. When I started to hear, they had a cafeteria, and all the people in the cafeteria worked for General Motors. Now it's all subcontractors. And I mean, even the community college where I worked had a bookstore, had a cafeteria run by the college. No more. Cisco runs the cafeteria, Barnes and Noble runs the bookstore, and so people who had jobs, county benefits, they're gone.
Why do you think so many blue-collar workers support Trump?
Because I think that he promises to turn the world back to the way it used to be, where they used to be secure. For example, as I said, I had a lot of work with this huge steel plant, Sparrows Point. It was a Bethlehem steel plant originally, biggest steel plant in the world at one time, 31,000 people. And it dropped down in 2012, finally after 4 different owners went bankrupt and everybody was displaced. And what all of those people wanted was for that plant to be open as if it were the 1950s again. You saw a huge political switch. It was an area where it was always elected a Democrat, and now it's all Republicans. And they went huge for Trump. And we still see some of the Facebook postings and stuff like that, that Trump is the greatest president and Biden is the worst. And one of the problems is that they wanted someone else to save the plant. And they could have stepped up. I later learned that steel workers down in Homestead, Pennsylvania, tried to figure out ways to take over the plant and even to buy it and to run it as theirs, as a co-op. And that information was not shared around the union, but it was something that the people here could have considered. But they just, that sense of being helpless, and here's a guy who's going to wave his magic wand and make everything okay again. I want that. And his approach to women and to race and things like that duplicates for a lot of white workers what they feel. And I'm really amazed at black women who will support Trump, for example. It just and claim it's a religious thing and everything. It's just I don't get it. I don't see the ambition, but it's a very, very complicated, a very, very bad political structure today. And I speak as a Green Party, as a third party. I was just in an article yesterday by Ralph Nader, who was a person that I know and have liked. And he said he's supporting Biden because it's a choice between an autocracy and fascism. And I would say to him, that's not the choice I want. That's not the choice I want for my kids. That's not the choice I want for Ollie and for Lita and for Charlie. That's not where we want to go. And we've got to stand up and challenge that. And everybody's got to do it. And people, so many people who are privileged, who are saying, well, I'm okay. I don't need a place to live. I got food. I'm not going to worry about it.
Yeah, I lived through Ronald Reagan running, saying that like it's almost like making America great again. Just
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and then afterwards, all the
morning in America, whatever it was. Yeah, but that was a sign of the decline at that time in the late 70s, early 80s. And the irony is that you had the two presidents who were formerly union members, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, the most anti-union, and are excused for it. Right. You find union people who supported Reagan in his second election and who would appear in public with Trump. And he was terrible for federal workers. He tried to eliminate unions for the federal employees and made it very, very difficult.
See, this is my best friend, Bill Barry, whom I know in 1977. Wasn't that true? 1977.
Yep.
You came to China.
You didn't speak much English then. You came to the hotel where our tour was staying. We were the first union tour to China. 1977, and I think maybe some of the people on the tour who are more politically involved knew Bill Hinton, and I think he came with you.
But I also remember you went to the Red Star Commune. You came to my parents' place.
That was, I came in 84. Well, I'm trying. Did we come then on that trip in 77 to Red Star?
I remember seeing you in 77, yeah.
Okay. But I remember coming several times after that, like 1985. I took trip and see, but you were then had moved to Philadelphia, and we were friends and neighbors, and
So and then we become, see, when we bought a house in the 80s, moved to the Aurora Street, and then you lived in Philly for a while, but not in our neighborhood. And then you bought a house in my neighborhood, and we had quite a few friends. June bought a house in that neighborhood, or renting. I forgot it's renting or bought a house. Anyway,
rented up the street. She rented on Bingham Street, but then your brother came.
Yeah, so we had a neighborhood of a lot of friends, and all the kids just running around different households, and they love to go to your house. you build you build a bunk bed for them, and with your carpenter skills, and you built a toolbox. I mean, the toy box for them. we had that for a long
Yep.
time, and also
We would take them to Baskin Robbins. That was the big
right. You love to
thrill.
take them to Baskin Robbins, have some ice cream, and they would go Easter hunting in your house.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were in Aurora Street for how many years?
I was on Bingham Street.
Bingham Street, right? Bingham Street. How many years?
Well, I moved in about 1982,
Uh-huh.
and then I left Philadelphia in 1988.
Oh, right. So they went to Baltimore, and you found your love of your life.
I went to Washington briefly, met Joan, but then I went to St. Louis, and then I think around 1990 or 91, I sold the house. I
Right.
rented it to two Chinese people
Right.
who names I don't remember. Wang Mei was one of them,
Right,
was
right,
living there.
right.
Did some work on it,
Right.
and it was a great experience.
Great, a lot of great memories. A lot of great
Yep.
memories. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So that's just a brief introduction to my friend Bill Berry's being a lifelong organizer. So let me continue some of the questions I have. There are a lot of people in China buy into this view that the workers in the US enjoy a much higher standard of living is because the US exploit third world countries.
I think that's true to a large extent.
Yeah. How in what way does
Well, because, for example, you cannot find clothing, shirts, pants, t-shirts, things like that, made in the United States anymore, shoes.
Right.
And they're made by horrible conditions in countries like Vietnam or Bangladesh and stuff like that. And so they're sold here, and it makes it look like we have a better standard of living because I can afford that. What we're seeing in the last year or so is that's disappearing, because rents and housing prices, stuff like that, have just gone up so high that people are really, really stressed. And as I said a couple of days ago in Baltimore, 30,000 people applied for public housing in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
That's 5% of the population of the city. And every one of those is a story of sacrifice and not having things that you need. And it certainly shows up in the schools. The schools are now serving, I saw in Philadelphia, breakfast and lunch for all the students. And it becomes a real crisis, for example, in the summertime when the schools are not open. The kids don't eat, and there's just no excuse. Capitalism is killing them, and we got to get rid of it. And it's unfortunate that countries that we thought were going to have a revolution, like China or Vietnam, Venezuela, I don't know what's going on in Nicaragua, have gone in bad directions.
So if you think that the standard of living in the US is higher than the third world country, is because the US exploiting a third world country. If that is the case, then there's no unity between the US working class and Chinese working class, for example. They are
well, that's right. There needs to be. And there's, I mean, the working class, the unions in this country don't help other unions out in their same cities, for Christ's sake. You don't see a lot of unions picketing, for example, with the auto workers. I went to a meeting last night in the community of college faculty that want to have legislation passed so they can organize, but no other union was there. The Teamsters didn't come, or the auto workers or other building trades, to say, here, we're going to show a sense of solidarity, because if one does better, we all do better.
Right.
So the movement is so weak that it's invisible, and people don't have a sense of there's a activity going on. So, and so that reaching out across to a foreign country is way beyond the imagination of most of the people here. You know, they don't follow what's going on in union issues in other countries. Their officers don't do it on a consistent basis. And so it's total control. The global capitalists run everything. They know how to take care of each other. And there's certain competition, but they're so enormous now that they're global. As I said,
So most people see people from other country, from other area, is their competitor, is threatening their
or
lives.
it's a threat. I mean, they see the immigrants, this whole hysteria over people coming across the border and coming into towns, and they don't recognize that most of us came from families who were immigrants, who left a country to come here because they thought things were going to be better.
Right.
And to change that is to go into those countries and make things better so people want to stay.
Right.